IVM.
It took us almost like 4 years for us to figure out what the fit was. So we were very clear that it is going to be people supporting people, right, for the needs that they have, right? So that was always the core vision of Milaap. We were always, focused on that peer-to-peer sort of a connection and for, needs, so to speak, needs, assistance, etc. We all internally call it a friend in your hour of need, right? But it was in 2014. So the first 4 years was a sort of a more of a managed sort of a platform in the sense that we were identifying people who had the need. We used to put their, profiles on the platform, and it was more to sort of do with people from rural or semi-urban backgrounds and so on and so forth.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. In 1997, a British rock band called Marillion wanted to tour the US. It required a spend of about $60,000, but the band did not have the resources for it. They did something interesting. They asked their fans if they would donate to pay for it. And the fans did. That is probably the first instance of modern day crowdfunding. We've come a long way since then, of course. The internet today has made it extremely easy for all of us to identify causes or projects that we resonate with and actually support them financially. My guest today, Anoj Viswanath, is the co-founder of Milaap, one of India's earliest crowdfunding platforms. I spoke to Anoj about how crowdfunding works in India and how his own journey in microfinance helped him conceive Milaap. Milaap has mobilized over 2,000 crores in donations since its inception. And his homepage is full of success stories on how animal shelters, communities during lockdown, and over 50,000 patients have all literally been saved by donations from people on this platform. I also spoke to Anoj about how a country like India looks at giving and how the perception that Indians do not give is actually a myth. Anoj spoke about how our healthcare industry, for example, is not just supported by donations by Good Samaritans, but is actually dependent on it. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Koffee Podcast.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Pesa Vesa, Anupam talks to Anurag Sinha. He is the co-founder of One Score and One Card. Anurag shares with Anupam the Indian credit landscape and the growth of personal credit across the country. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth talks about the recent phenomena called quiet quitting and what are its pros and cons. On A Niche Thing, Anish and his team at Swami list down the criteria for finding the perfect black t-shirt in India. This may sound simple, but it's tougher than it sounds. On Advertising is Dead, It's All Business, Varun is joined by Ketan Mavin Kurve. He is the CEO and founder of Alpha Coach, a fitness app. They discuss the blending of fitness with tech and what might be the way ahead. And on The Habit Coach, Ashton takes a listener query and lists down some tips on how they can comfort their partner during period pains. Once again, I'd like to remind you all, we have some amazing merchandise on the IVM Podcast website. Go to the website, ivmpodcast.com, and you can click the shop button and it will take you to our partners beyond follow. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And please do tell a friend if you're enjoying this show. Word of mouth does help us a lot. Also, wherever you're listening to the show, give us a rating, give us a review. That is always helpful. Also, do remember to check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels operating over there. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Mutual Fund, TransUnion Sibyl, Volvo XC40 Recharge, Checkpoint Software, and Smallcase. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. Anoj, how are you doing? Where are you talking to us from?
From Bangalore, the south part of Bangalore, the non-flooded part of Bangalore, if I may say so.
Right. I mean, I was going to make some jokes, but then I think it's a little too tragic.
Yeah.
So I've stopped making jokes about what Bangalore. I moved on to the Queen in the last few days. But honestly, how bad has it been? I mean, is it? I mean, of course, you're on Twitter, you're seeing all these images, and then you speak to friends. They're like, it's very bad. I know a friend who left 5 hours before her flight, and she said she actually had to get down 1.5 kilometers before the airport and then take a bus to the airport. How bad is it?
I think Parts of the Bangalore have been completely submerged per se. I think the Bangalore which sort of was built in the last 20 25 years, if I say so, right? So the stretches, on the outer ring road and so on, the newer places, so to speak, which is where most of your tech parks and all of the recent real estate and development has happened. But a large part of the Bangalore, which you would probably call as the old Bangalore, for a lack of better word, I think life has remained business as usual, which means traffic still remains, but at least not because of rains, so to say. So, so places like, Malleshwaram, JP Nagar, Jayanagar, those places have, largely remained same as before.
Yeah, I mean, just for people who are listening to this much later, this is the 10th of September, 2022. And Bangalore just had some unprecedented sort of rainfall and flooding. But this story you said, Anoj, is, how many times have we heard this in the last few years, right? Same story in Chennai, same story in Bombay. Everything new that we've created in the last 25 years has been at the receiving end of flooding in most cities. Anyway, that is not, thankfully, what we're talking about. We're going to talk about your journey and stuff. But before we go there, Anoj, talk to us a little bit about growing up. Where did you grow up? What was home? What was childhood like?
So, I was born and brought up in Coimbatore in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. So, I grew up in the suburbs of Coimbatore. My mother was a history teacher, so she used to teach history and geography at school. My father was a spinning master in a textile cotton spinning mills. So Coimbatore is known as a Manchester of India per se. A lot of activity around textiles. So so growing up was fun because you grew up. I grew up in the 90s, as they call it, right? So which is when you've seen the sort of the emergence of access to information or access to the outside world, so to speak, the color TVs and the cable connections and whatnot and so on. So it was fun. I went to one of the best schools in the city, even though it was like 15, 17 kilometers away from where we used to stay. So I mean, public transport was great. Get to see all kinds of stuff. Did very well in school. I mean, because when education is sort of the most priority, so did very well in school. Hobbies were mostly to do with quizzing. I was a quizzing maniac growing up, so you name a quiz, I would have probably participated.
Were you in Landmark much?
Yes, Landmark. Yeah, the August 15th Landmark every year. Yeah. So Landmark was one. The Hindu Young World was the another.
Yeah.
The ESPN School Quiz Olympiad. So all of that stuff. So quizzing was a great passion. We used to play soccer for school and so on. And it was essentially do well in academics, figure out what to do next in life. Like most people say, when you don't know what to do, you study engineering. When you don't know what to study in engineering, you study mechanical engineering. So I also ended up doing that. Otherwise, grew up with, I have an elder sibling and we had 2 dogs. It was a very spacious sort of it was almost like 25 cents of land in which only 1/5 is house and the remaining was all sort of, open space and so on. So spent more time outside than at home, so to speak, like most of us in that age. But yes, it was fun. Yeah.
There's this saying. I grew up in Chennai. When we refer to people from Coimbatore, we say this in Tamil, which is "Nalla thanni kudichu valanam." People who drank good water and not the metro water which you get piped in Chennai.
There's an urban legend. We don't know if it is still true or not, but the story goes like Sirwani is the second sweetest fresh water in the world after Lake Superior. I don't know. This is a legend that has continued since my childhood. So Sirwani is one of the rivers, the lifeline of Coimbatore per se. But yes, you are right that the water is pristine, for a lack of better word. Yeah,
excellent. We should. I'm sure at some point in this conversation we'll talk about quizzing. I was very big in the Landmark circuit as well, and of course later on more in the Tata Crucible side of things.
Oh yes.
Later on, I'm assuming post engineering life would take you towards Singapore and microfinance. Was that the line you were pursuing early on in your career?
So to be very honest, I went and did undergrad in Singapore. And that was nothing but short of serendipity, right? So, I got a chance scholarship to go and study at, National University of Singapore when I finished my class 12. And I was looking at between, the usual stuff, right? IIT, BITS, and so on. And here I got a scholarship. I still couldn't figure out how I made it, but look, I made it, right? So I ended up there. And even then, it was more about sort of, study well, find a good job, and, probably settle there. That was always the sort of the intention, so to speak. And it was in Singapore, for the first time I heard the word, and I'm not making this up, I heard the word entrepreneurship. Until then, I've never heard the word entrepreneurship, so to speak, right?
It was not a buzzword when
It
you
was
went to
not a
college
buzzword.
in the
Yeah,
90s
exactly.
and the early 2000s. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So, for us, it's always about anybody who runs something on their own is a businessman, right? And and businessman essentially means like, it's almost like you need to have something, you either well connected or you come from, sort of privileges and so on and so forth. So that is never sort of seen as a option, so to speak, right? So, but yeah, so Singapore opened me to the world of possibilities.
It's not even an aspiration, right? None
It's
of us
not
grow
even
up
an
saying, I want to
aspiration.
grow up and become a businessman, right? That's
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's when it opened up me to the possibilities of the whole world of, startups. And this was like what, 2006, 2007, so on, right? And also the place where I realized very quickly after my first year that, I'm not the engineer that I set out to become, right? So it gave me the opportunity to sort of diversify. So I ended up doing a second minor in economics. I started studying business minor and so on and so forth. But again, I mean, it was not a career option that I thought of. It was just something that I was fascinated by, did internships, but never thought myself to become an entrepreneur. But I think what changed was I was about to graduate in 2009, and in 2008 September there was this whole banking and financial crisis, so to speak. And all my 3 years of my life, all I did was to do internships and sort of figure out a way to get a job in an investment bank or a consulting, and I realized that that's not going to happen. So I took a sabbatical because I was like, if you can't get a job next year, you might as well postpone your graduation and sort of figure it out next. So that's how, I ended up sort of took a leave of absence from the university almost for a year and a half, and ended up coming to India. And, I knew a few people from past, and I reached out to them. And incidentally, one of them was working in microfinance space. And he said, okay, why don't you come join me? We are looking for people to sort of, we are looking for Excel warriors, so to speak. So I said, yeah, that's great, because that's a skill that I can, comfortably say I have. So I went there, and those 12 to, I spent almost like 15, 16 months. That sort of changed my perspective on life. Most people say travel changes you, travel gives you a different perspective. I was able to sort of experience it in a slightly different way. But yes, because my job took me to sort of go to the hinterlands in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and then up north, UP, Bihar, etc. per se. And my job was basically to do surveys with people who had sort of received these small microfinance loans. So for people, who are listening for the first time, microfinance is essentially giving small loans to people who don't have any other form of asset. And essentially, you're trusting that the person would use that money to sort of build a better life, right? Running a very small sort of a business, let's say, buy more goats or buy another sort of cattle, or, set up a small fancy store or a grocery store and so on, right? And these amounts are like what, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 rupees. That's the kind of this one. And, talking to them and understanding how this has impacted and what their aspirations were really, changed my perspective. And I decided at that point that I wanted to sort of work in the space. Even at that point in time, I never envisaged myself to become an entrepreneur. I said, this is a space that I want to work. But yes, a year down the line, I realized that the only way I could work in this space is by starting up on my own.
Before we go there, I think this is a very important phase, in your life and also in the life of Milaap, right? Can you go a little deeper into some of the experiences that you saw, that you went through in this phase, in these journeys?
Yeah. So my role essentially was to sort of understand from these folks, what else do they need from the organization? Like, what else can we serve them for, right? And I was specifically looking at, what we call as basic necessities. It had like education, clean water, energy solutions, and so on. So I was very fascinated by energy and clean water solutions. So I was basically, sort of going to these houses, talking to people as to what they were doing for their energy needs, right? And it was fascinating in the sense that, people, when we asked people, for example, we had a portable solar lighting solution, right? Like a portable torchlight powered by solar, portable lantern powered by solar, right? And the first thing that we used to do is to place this in front of them and ask, would you buy something like this? And they would say, sure, we would buy. And we would say, okay, how much would you pay for? This was just a discovery to understand what. And they would essentially say, probably 300 rupees or 400 rupees, so to speak, right? The actual sort of price, and it is considered as an affordable one, was like 1,200 rupees, right? But when we try to understand, but why do you think it is 400 rupees, etc.? And their comparison was, look, there are similar products, right, which are essentially there in the market, and they all cost 300, 400 rupees, which is essentially the products that are sort of imported from, let's say, China, etc., not powered by solar and so on. But so the first learning essentially was, when it comes to pricing a product, it's more to do with what the customer perceives as the value of that product, as opposed to sort of, going the bottom up, which is essentially say it costed me to make this much and this is the cost for me, etc. You'd always want to sort of see from the customer's perspective, right? So we said, look, beyond 400 rupees, I can't pay for this, right? And which is when we sort of thought about a structure and we said, okay, how about you pay us 50 rupees every week for 25 weeks? You take this product and every week we will come collect 50 rupees from you. Would you be okay with it? And they said, yes, that makes sense. Right? Here was a customer 15 minutes ago who was saying, I won't pay more than 400 rupees, right? And 15 minutes later, when I just offer the same one saying that, why don't you pay 50 rupees, but pay every week for the next 25 weeks, which means almost like 1250, 3x this original perception. And they were cool with it, right? So when a purchase is being made, it is not just sort of, it is a combination of the perceived value, what kind of cash flows that they deal with, etc., as opposed to sort of, the company thinking about it, or, the business thinking about bottom up, saying that, okay, this is our cost, this is essentially it, should be our margins. That was very fascinating. The second one, which was very fascinating, was, we, sort of divided the household segments into like 3 categories. Like people who had no electricity at all, right? So people who had no electricity connection and nothing. And there were people who had households where electricity, every day they would have electricity anywhere between, 6 to 12 hours. So for the remaining 12 hours, they don't have electricity. Just heads up, we are talking about 2009, when electrification was still a major challenge. I know, we have come a long way since then. And then there were households.
And it is still a challenge in some places.
Still in some places, right? And then there are households which are 12 to 18 hours electricity, which means they don't have 5 to 6 hours. And then there are households with more than 18 hours electricity. Our original perception was, the guys who don't have electricity are the ones who would essentially sort of, buy this because, and we were very clear that they should have school going children. They have like a sort of a small farmland, which means that they have to travel in the night to sort of, switch on motors or whatever, etc. So we knew that these were the value propositions for something like this. And we went and offered this. The people who took adoption for this the most were the ones who had electricity for 12 to 18 hours and 18 to 24 hours, right? And the reason was, once they were used to electricity, they realized what not having electricity meant, right? As opposed to the folks who have never experienced, that kind of connectivity. They were like, it's okay, life goes on. We will, we'll buy kerosene, the kerosene lamps would do, etc., etc. So, and these were people of the same sort of disposable income. So we are not even talking about, extremely poor, same disposable income, just that they were in places where there is no electricity connectivity, etc. Right? But houses which had access wanted to buy this more than houses that did not. So only once you experience, you would then realize that you want that, you realize that what productivity actually means and what this. So, bunch of such, contrarian, if you may say so, in terms of observations, so to speak. And that, and that was, and the biggest, stuff when, we wanted to sort of do a entire household sort of electricity per se, right? Like by putting in panels, slightly costlier one, anywhere between 8 to 12,000 rupees per se, a solar system which can power like 2 fans in a house, 4 lights, etc., and so on. And the people who actually purchased, they essentially came back and said, you know what? You don't have to power my fans. You don't have to power my lights. Can you just power my TV? So there were households which had this was pertinent, especially in the South, where dish connection was prevalent, right? But electricity was not. So more households were essentially saying, boss, I have a dish connection. Like they have a dish antenna, but they did not have access to, regular uninterrupted electricity. They said, look, can we use this to power our television between 7 p.m. to 10 p.m.? That's all we care for. We don't care whether the fans run or whether the lights work. So fascinating in terms of when you sort of, I'm sure anybody who works in FMCG or rural sort of distribution would have like such anecdotes. But yeah, above everything else, it taught you that your perception of what people need is not necessarily what people think that they need, right? You might probably think, these are poor folks, so they basically need just whatever, food, clothing, shelter, or whatever, and so on. But, aspirations, especially in the last, 15, 20 years, because of access to information and access to whatever, aspirations are the same across the country, where the accessibility and affordability are the two questions, but aspirations are like, there is no like, just because I'm poor, I'm not going to aspire for something is not happening. That's not what it is on the ground. Yeah.
Right. Was Milaap your first startup idea?
Yes, Milaap was indeed my first startup idea, so to speak. Yeah. And it has remained that way for 12, 13 years now. Yeah. So, yeah.
What is the birth story?
Yeah. So I did this for 12, 15 months. And then I had to come back to the university to graduate. They said, hey, we gave you a scholarship. You better come and finish your degree. And so I went back but the idea always sort of remained in my head. I think, sort of three questions remained in my head was like, one was how access to small amount of money, had a tremendous impact on people's life. So that was something that was very fascinating to me. Of course, I grew up in Coimbatore, I've lived, etc. But still, it is a city and so on, right? You've never sort of thought what 2,000 rupees or 5,000 rupees could actually have like a sort of an impact or whatever per se. So that question was there. The second one was how, despite the fact that it is still small, a large number of people still don't have access to it, right? Despite the fact that, yes, it's just 5,000 rupees or 7,000 rupees for sort of a shot at a better life, it was still inaccessible to a large number. And this, despite the fact that microfinance was around for 30, 35 years and so on, and had become mainstream. And the third one was essentially, which sort of, connected the dots and actually made me think about, is there an opportunity to start? Which was, I went back and I used to sort of share these stories from what I saw, etc., with my friends who are, were obviously they were living bankers, consultants, and all that stuff. And I was, whenever I tried to sort of explain, I sort of converted it in Singapore dollars or US dollars and tell them those stories. And they were very fascinated. They said, are you telling me $100 is all it takes for somebody to sort of have a reasonable chance at escaping their current situation and sort of making at least to the next level? That seems like a no-brainer. Why isn't more people not doing it, right? And this was like the sort of, are you saying me that it just costs, $15 to sort of replace a kerosene lamp and provide somebody a clean lighting solution with no, additional cost? That seems like a no-brainer, right? Which is where I sort of understood that, or it sort of connected that the perception of impact versus risk vastly varied between how you think of it as an individual versus how you think of an institution. So if you are an institution, a financial institution, the way you think about risk is you're thinking about, okay, these are folks, okay, they come from they don't have collaterals, they come from demographics which are extremely volatile when it comes to cash flows. So this is going to be high risk, and accordingly we'll have to sort of figure out a structure. Whereas when it comes to individuals, looking at it from the same perspective, they are essentially looking at it more from an impact first story, right? Which is essentially what could be the possibility, what could possibly become right, as opposed to what could possibly go wrong, right? And that's where I realized that, hey, if we want to sort of take a shot at addressing some of this in our own way, it's not like changing the world, but sort of changing your own world, if I were to put it that way, then it has to be people powered as opposed to sort of thinking about it from an institutional sort of structure. And that's where the idea of crowdfunding came into picture, where we said, what if we were to tell these actual stories, the stories that I was telling my friends, right? What if I were to sort of tell those stories on the internet and essentially ask people to come and support any amount per se, $5, $10, 500 rupees, 1,000 rupees, whatever it is. And, and that sort of, became a bit of an obsession once it sort of fit in my head. And I said, okay. And that's the original sort of the thesis with which we, the idea essentially came. And then, of course, we,
Right.
started our execution in a small way in 2010. Yeah.
It's a 2010 is it's an interesting time for this, right? Like platforms like Kickstarter are all starting to do well. There are a few others, but at the same time, in a country like India, digital payments are still a challenge. Are actually non-existent. Forget challenge. E-commerce in itself is just extraordinarily nascent. A very negligible part of India at that point is actually paying on credit cards on the e-commerce sites. What was your reason to believe, right, that this would work, right? Because of course, then there is a question of what is the business model? What's your revenue model from these, right? So for someone who engineering, Singapore, microfinance, you want to obviously start something of value. How are you thinking of these things?
Frankly, to be very honest, it all seems like a blur as to how we ended up even starting up. Because if I knew what I knew then, I wouldn't have even started up, right? So I think that's the difference between first-time entrepreneurs versus, let's say, serial entrepreneurs per se. When a serial entrepreneur starts, there's a lot of top-down thinking that goes, right? How big can this be? What are the challenges? How would you think about revenues? How would you think about scaling? What do you attack first, etc., etc.? That comes from experience. But most first-time entrepreneurs, especially if you're just fresh out of college, like I was, and I just started up, you are just obsessed with the problem. And it's a more of a bottom up, if I were to say, right? Like you're like, okay, this is the problem, this is the product, this is the offering, and this makes so much more sense. You're not really sort of thinking about how big can this be, and how would you sort of scale your revenues. Of course, you think about, I would earn some fee in the process and all those kind of stuff, but it's not sort of well defined, well thought through, so to speak. It's both a blessing in the sense that, being naive and sort of taking an attack. I mean, like you said, right? Like if you were a seasoned entrepreneur, you would have never taken a shot at this space at all, right? Because, at that point in time, maybe at future, like you said, the ecosystem, the card penetration and all of those, so to speak. But it was also, sort of given that, I was so obsessed with it, we said, yes, we will go. And one of the things that we were very sort of clear was like, we will go global from day one. What that essentially meant was that we want anybody across the world to sort of support people in India, right? That was my in fact, I said that's going to be our USP and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that also meant a lot of work on the regulatory side, right? Because bringing in capital into India, etc., it has its own sort of rules and regulations, so to speak. So it almost took us 15 months, so to speak, since we decided to start up to get like the full-fledged approval. We got a small approval of sorts to show how the regulators were very patient and very sort of supportive. They were like, okay, these are me and my other co-founder. These are two guys who have something. Okay, let's, anyway, the scale is very small. So let's give them, under the existing sort of frameworks, how they could essentially. So they were very patient and supportive. And it took us almost 15 months to sort of say, yes, we are now open to the world for anybody to sort of support per se. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's frankly speaking, I was just obsessed. That's all. That's the only thing that I can think of. Yeah.
Right. I think it's an interesting problem that you set out to solve, right? Like I'm a huge fan of Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and for the uninitiated, basically he talks about two kinds of problems, right? One is the 0 to 1 is already done, and then you're replicating that idea, which is generally what he refers to as globalization. And then there is this, which is actually more of a 1 to n sort of a problem. And then the 0 to 1 is like, it doesn't exist. Nothing like that exists. So you're in a way sort of building it, which refers to as a technology problem. And in your case, while there is a 1 to n situation because Kickstarter exists and some of these models exist, from an Indian perspective, it is not at all the same. So from the Indian perspective, it is more a 0 to 1 sort of a problem, isn't it? Which is why I thought, the fact that you had so much conviction and you continue to have, Now, of course, it's much easier since you've seen it as a success. Which is why I was trying to understand, what was your plan back then. But for those of you who doesn't understand the space, right? Like, how are you planning to build this into a business? Can you break it down as a business model for
Absolutely.
those who might not
So, just before I get into the business aspect of it, one thing that we realized, just to close your previous question, it took us almost like 4 years for us to figure out what the fit was. So we were very clear that it is going to be people supporting people, right, for the needs that they have, right? So that was always the core vision of Milaap. We were always, focused on that peer-to-peer sort of a connection, and for needs, so to speak, needs, assistance, etc. We all internally we call it a friend in your hour of need, right? But it was in 2014. So the first 4 years was a sort of a more of a managed sort of a platform, in the sense that we were identifying people who had the need. We used to put their profiles on the platform, and it was more to sort of do with people, people from rural or semi-urban backgrounds and so on and so forth, because that's also because we came from a microfinance background, so we were very sort of comfortable with that kind of a structure, so to speak. I think in 2014 was when we realized that combination of many things. Almost 4 years into it, what we realized was, we had a small set of users who were super passionate, right? Like by that time, we had like probably around 8 to 9,000 people who were using and contributing through the platform. They used to come every month or every alternate month to sort of add in, top up more in terms of contributions and so on. But it wasn't sort of growing per se, right? So it was a model that appealed to only a very sort of a niche sort of a audience, so to speak, who are very super passionate about what they were doing and super happy about it. And so that sort of was a bit of a bummer for us, because all along we wanted to sort of build a large scale sort of consumer sort of a play in the giving space.
So sorry, just to break this down in everyone's interest, what you're saying is that the same people who want to donate kept coming back to donate to other causes.
Yeah, exactly.
You were not finding new takers.
So it was actually a slightly different model than a donation. It was what we call as an interest-free loan, which meant that you give, let's say, 1,000 rupees to somebody, and that person basically says he will pay it over 12 months, right? So every month, the person essentially pays back whatever, 80 or 100 rupees, whatever the number is, right? And that comes back to you in the form of what we call as Milaap credits. Now you have the chance to sort of withdraw that money or re-lend it to somebody else, right? So most people come in, they re-lend the money, and then they again top it up with another, let's say, 500 rupees to somebody else. So that cycle was happening, right? They come in.
So at that point, what kind of causes were people giving these interest-free loans for?
Yeah, mostly for small businesses, then followed by sanitation, right? People like, for example, building toilets in their home, and then clean energy, like buying smokeless cook stoves or electrification at home and so on. Like basically basic necessities, vocational training, skill development, and those were the major sort of causes, so to speak, right? But that number of people sort of increasing was not happening, right? Simply because the model, as unique as it was also sort of off for most people. They were like, am I doing charity? Am I doing investment? What is this? You're saying that I'm supporting somebody, but that person also sort of comes back and pays back, etc. and so on. So we were very stuck there. And that's when we opened up the platform out of no choice. Like we saw that, there were a lot of requests coming in from people saying that, hey, my security guard has a medical emergency. Can Milaap sort of support? We would guarantee, etc. and so on. So we said, hey, look, when you allow people to sort of nominate or sort of raise money for the people that they know of, maybe the story could become much more larger, as opposed to us telling that, this is the person and you have to only contribute to this person or that person, etc. Sort of not only allow people to sort of contribute, but also to come and basically raise money for people that they care for, or essentially nominate people they care for. And that's how we opened up the platform. So the Milaap, as you know it today, was something that sort of originated in end of 2014, 2015. And that took off. So the first 6 months of that almost sort of did what we did in 4 years before. And we realized, like, look, this is essentially where the power of sort of internet and social networks comes into picture, because now you're giving people the choice to sort of also, determine not only where they want to give, but also for whom they want to sort of raise money and so on and so forth, right? So it actually solved for a need for the user. as opposed to, giving as such. Nobody wakes up in the morning and searches in Google saying, where do I donate today? Nobody does that, right? Very few people, probably if at all. But let's say when you're stuck with an emergency, let's say a medical emergency or some kind of a emergency per se, you would look for options. So that is actually a need. And that has been the case all along. I mean, crowdfunding is just a new sort of on the internet is just a new fancy thing. But let's say somebody in family sort of meets with a medical emergency. What usually happens is the closest five of the relatives or the closest five of the friends essentially come and support them, saying that, okay, we'll support you, etc. What we essentially did was to sort of make that from 5, 10 people to, like, let's say hundreds of people, the people that you went to school with, the people that you worked with, your neighbors, your community, extended relatives, etc. per se. So asking for money less harder, because more than giving, asking is a hard thing to do. So yes, so that's essentially how we pivoted, and our model until 2020 was, yes, we are a self sort of funded company, so to speak. So our model was to sort of earn a fee on the funds raised. So we used to sort of charge 5% on the funds that were raised, so to speak, right? So if you don't raise anything, we don't earn anything. But if you raise something, we charge a 5%. Simple sort of a model, so to speak. In 2020, we flipped that and we sort of made it what was called as pay what you wish, which means the platform is free to sort of use. And we ask donors to basically add what is called as a voluntary tip while making a donation. And people who raise the money also, we ask them, hey, do you want to add a tip while they withdraw the funds that are raised, so to say. So we leave it in the hands of the users to determine, how much they want to sort of pay, so to speak, to keep Milaap sort of running. And that has, sort of helped us well in the extent that, we continue with that model for the past 2+ years. So yeah, so that's essentially our model. Yeah.
But prior to that, was the model different?
Prior to when? 2020. Prior to 20. Yeah. So it was a simple model. We used to charge a 5% fee. So if I raise 100, I'd charge a 5 rupees. The recipient gets 95 or 94, depending upon whatever payment processing, etc. per se. So that was the model, right? So, and in 2020, we flipped it because, again, it was actually an interesting situation that happened that led us to this.
So the reason I was asking is what prompted the change for you?
So for natural disasters, as a policy on the platform, we never charge a platform fee, like since inception. So if somebody is raising money for a natural disaster or an issue of national importance, we never charge a fee. So let's say there were Chennai floods and Kerala floods and all of those, like people raising money for Pulwama martyrs and all of those, we never charge a fee. The platform fee is zero, so to speak. And that's our way of saying, hey, this is how we show solidarity as a platform. So when the COVID lockdown was announced in March 2020, right, we said, okay, like a large number of people are going to be impacted because of, the lockdown, etc. So it's almost like a sort of the scale is going to be similar to like how people face when a disaster hits. So we will waive off our fee, right? Typically what happens is, yes, while we do that, people also raise money for other causes and all that stuff. And, that sort of takes care of cross-subsidizing this, right? Like, it earns us goodwill also, right? That's the whole, also the reason to sort of do something like this. So in this one, two things happened. One, the scale was so, the scale of the lockdown, and as a result of it, the fundraising scale was so large, right, that literally my April 2020 was like some 5x in terms of costs as opposed to March 2020, right? Because our server costs were just going through the roof, our traffic was going through the roof, and all of that had to be paid for, right? So that was 5x, and we were making no money, right? And second was there were no other causes that people were raising money for, right? So because the hospitals were all sort of shut or were only, sort of focused or whatever, people, all their treatments were essentially getting postponed, and so very, very little for. So we had a month where we had the highest sort of contributions volumes, and we had the biggest negative also on the same month per se. So we said, boss, if we go down this route, we'll have to shut shop in 3 months. That's all we had, right, in terms of the cash that we had in bank. So we asked ourselves, what are the options? One is to sort of revert back to the original, saying that no, we are going to charge a 5%. I said, boss, the level of disaster that we would have in terms of just communication would be like, because irrespective of what it is, at the end of the day, it would look very insensitive for us to go back and say, So we said, okay, that's sort of ruled out. What else could we do? Can we raise a grant separately to sort of cover for it? But again, trying the institutional grant route it's not going to solve for the next month. Maybe whatever, somebody might sort of support 6 months down the line. Then we said, why not ask the same crowd to sort of support us, saying that, hey, we are doing this for free and we need money to keep the lights on, so would you be able to support?
And do people do that? Does it work?
Yeah, it works, which is the reason we had conviction to sort of move from like only for natural disasters to like completely for all causes. We said it's a pay what you wish model. It was a contrarian bet, right, which was saying that, because the moment I told this internally, people were like, we don't even tip in hotels and restaurants. Who is going to tip us?
Yeah.
And I said, look, what's the worst that can come out? We are right now at zero. At least a few people would do. So at least it would sort of cover for something. But we were very fascinated by the sort of the support that we received per se.
What we're talking about is a very interesting part of human behavior, right? You made a conscious decision to switch, which is actually not a small switch, it's a switch of your entire revenue model, right? Into this. Is it now you feel that this new model of people tipping, is that big enough for you to sustain the organization the way you did before 2020, or is it a very minuscule fraction of what it used to be?
It allows us to sustain, from a net revenues perspective per se, right? Which is essentially to run the ops, the business, the people, all the tech admin tools, etc., so to speak. It is tipping which essentially sort of takes care of our expenses. So that way, it is the model per se, right? It also comes with a certain sort of, I wouldn't call it challenges, but a certain set of trade-offs, right? Like we are very conscious in sort of our, for example, our own sort of brand awareness, marketing spends, etc., so to speak, right? So we are very conscious about it because that's something that you can't sort of drive through with this as a sort of a model. You need to have deep reserves, so to speak, right? So that's the trade-off that we took. We said, hey, you know what? We will rather sort of bet on the word of mouth, sort of, and we've been around for like 10 years now. So we'd rather drive on the positivity word of mouth. And it also comes with a certain positives for the business, which is essentially, look, we've seen it is directly correlated to how seamless the product experience is and how seamless the customer experience is. So, for example, right? So when, in most, it's a case with all, sort of payment, any payment you try to make in India, right? So more often than not, the first one fails and then you will have to retry again and sort of do it. We saw an interesting behavior where whenever there is a failure, right? So somebody tries to make a donation, right? And it fails. And they come back to sort of make the second attempt. The second attempt, they don't tip. Like they switch off the tipping option and they sort of, which is essentially, sort of a subtle way of them. It's, I mean, they're not doing it consciously, but it's a subtle way of, showing their, sort of dissatisfaction, saying that, hey, the product did not work the way I thought it should have, right? So we were like, okay, then it essentially means we have to invest more in our payment gateway integrations and product robustness around it, because that's the make or break, right? We've seen where whenever our NPS scores in customer service goes down, there is a correlation with the tipping also sort of going down, right? So let's say a customer service agent replies tangential to a question or gives like a textbook response, etc. But people are dissatisfied, and you can clearly see that also has an impact on the tipping. So it forces you as a business to sort of focus on the fundamentals, which is essentially a seamless product and a good customer service, so to speak. And the reverse has also been true, where people have been like, okay, I had a great relationship manager who handheld me throughout the fundraising process, so I want to sort of tip them, tip the organization, whatever, a percentage, and so on and so forth. So that's the trade-off, right? It's a model which is great if you are building a business which has a steady state, organic sort of a growth. It can sort of, and it may not be applicable on day one. Like we didn't do it on day one. It took us a while to sort of build the switch there. But if you are sort of a business which is looking at sort of what you call as the rocket ship kind of a growth, or exponential growth, which requires you to sort of invest deep money into marketing, brand awareness, etc., then this model as such may not be your the core.
Right.
You would still need deep pockets otherwise.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we took the choice. We made a choice saying that we would focus on the former.
Anuj, I want
as
to
a
go
business.
back a little bit, right, to the mid 2010s and sort of ask you a very different question, right? Like, see, you can call it the product market fit. I remember in one of the other interviews you had mentioned how it took you many years before you understood what the actual product market fit was. But I'm going to rephrase the question in a different way, right? Like in doing this for the first 7-8 years, what did you sort of understand about giving in India? And the reason I'm asking you is that you said that the platform started by people donating to small businesses and sanitation projects, etc. Then, of course, at some point, health becomes a very important thing. Today, when I go to the Milaap homepage, there are more cancer pieces than anything else. So clearly, health seems to be an area. But what else have you understood about just the nature of giving when it comes to a country like India?
Yeah, I think there are, the first misconception is Indians don't give, right? That's commonly sort of understood. And then there are also sort of numbers which sort of talk about, okay, the percentage of our giving vis-a-vis the GDP and so on and so forth and so on. I think the biggest learning for me over the last 10, 12 years is the definition of giving, right? If you define giving by a narrow sort of a framework, which is to say giving for a certain kind of a cause or a certain kind of a structure, if you're giving to NGO which does welfare, etc., if that's how you define charitable giving as, then sure, that numbers or that this one would look small. But if you basically say giving as something where I contribute without expecting anything in return to someone in need that I know of or I can relate to, right? Then that number is massive, right? And the health is essentially an outcome or the sort of the validation of it. Like, so if you were to look at in general, just stepping at the macro level, right? Just to sort of validate this point, India's healthcare expenditure is out of pocket healthcare expenditure, right? Like people paying from their pocket is almost $100 billion a year. We are like probably the second or the third largest when it comes to percentage of out of pocket. Right, nearly 70% of our healthcare expenses are essentially paid out of pocket. Right, comparable numbers. I mean, people claim US is broken and all that stuff, which is to some extent true. But even there, I think the out of pocket is, I think, in like mid 20s to early 30s, like 25 to 30%. 70% is still covered by some form of government or insurance, etc. So that 70%, right? So there are savings, there are insurance, and all of that. But interestingly, there is in the Ministry of Health report, there is a line which basically says friends, family, local Samaritans who contribute $5 billion every year towards healthcare expenditures. So every year, $5 billion of our healthcare expenditure is covered by friends, family, local relatives, local, community circles, etc. Right? This has been there. It's not a new phenomenon, right? And what does that essentially mean, right? That essentially means that people give to somebody who is in need that they know or know of, so to speak, right? And that's essentially what is translating as whether it's Milaap or any of these crowdfunding platforms on why health, right? A minuscule, like a portion of that is essentially coming online, so to speak, right? So broadly, from a giving perspective, there are three. If you were to sort of break it into pyramid, right? There are three layers as to how people think about giving, right? The top of the one, which is essentially a small portion, but also the sort of the highest level, like almost think of it like a Maslow's hierarchy, if you want to, right? The top of the one is people giving to brands, right? Brand is something that, if I were to basically say, tell me the names of 10 NGOs or charities that you know of, right? The names that come up, the overlap of those names is essentially a brand. Like you will have, people would say, Akshay Patra, Goonj, Teach for India, etc. All of those names would overlap, and those numbers won't be more than 20, 30, right? So people give, that's a small niche. The second one essentially is people give to events. Events can be positive in nature. Events can be negative in nature. Like I give because it's my birthday. I give it's my wedding anniversary. It's my salary day, and so on. Or I give because in memory of my mother who passed away to cancer, etc., etc. These can also be public in nature or private in nature. So public, there's a large-scale disaster, etc., etc., or there is a festive season, Diwali, and so on, right? So that's essentially when when and why people give, right? People give to brands, people give to events, right? Which is slightly larger than the first one. Most of the giving is people giving to people, which is defined by a very simple thesis. I give because I know the person who is in need, or I give because I know the person who's asking me to give, right? So, okay, I know Karthik, and Karthik's friend has met with something, and Karthik is asking me to contribute. I don't know that friend. I can't relate to what it is. But hey, you know what? I know Karthik. So if he's asking me, I want to sort of show my solidarity, right? Or, oh, this is my caretaker. I want to sort of support her. They are going through a crisis, etc. So I would sort of support. This large base is essentially what is sort of powering, let's say, most of the crowdfunding and so on and so forth per se. So it is not that people don't give, that perception. It is, in fact, I think in an absolute number, and this has been shown in many, like Bain came up with some reports saying that every year at least 250 million Indians actually give some kind of money or some kind of assistance. It's about how you define giving per se. And the moment you sort of widen the scope, then you would, sort of realize also comes to do with the, the nature of the society itself, right? That's the second learning that I've learned is, the Western societies is a trust first society, which essentially means I will trust you until you break it. Right. So if you offer a new product, let's say when Kickstarter launched and they said, hey, this is a cool way by which you can support artists and creators, etc. The adoption was like, oh, this is a great way to sort of do it, right? People didn't know whether the guy who's raising $500,000 would actually deliver the watch or the cool stuff that he's talking about. But they went and bet on it because that's how those societies are until you sort of break that trust.
Right.
Whereas, India as such, and this has got not just giving it, I'm sure in every aspect of life, so to speak, it is a trust deficit society, which essentially means I will not trust you until you earn it, right? Which means you show me why you are trustworthy. You show me why, as opposed to sort of saying that I hope you're not, untrustworthy, right? So, which is also the reason why it took us so long for us. I mean, almost like until 2017, 18, the work was mostly to sort of build on the trust, etc. The scale was, sort of growing per se. So, and the part about this is it's not just because you've earned the trust does not necessarily mean that's no longer a problem. In fact, even today, the biggest problem that we face, and I'm sure this is the biggest problem that we will face, biggest challenge that we will face 5 years down the line is also how do we earn that trust? Right? How do we continue to retain that trust? Because as you grow, you'd also sort of see challenges that come where it takes a couple of incidents to sort of, bring it back to square one, and again, sort of, you'll have to restore it, etc. So I think these are sort of our learnings when it comes to, thinking about giving as such. I don't know. I went in many tangents. So
no, it was beautiful tangents. But tell me, this trust issue, there are two levels, right?
Yeah.
One is, today, after 12 years of your existence, people trust the platform.
Yeah.
I know that if something is on Milaap, then it's probably there is some level of due diligence, and I know that it's legit.
Yeah.
Right? And then there is the trust of the cause itself, which is where I often wondered, platforms like yours, you're actually taking up the burden of building the trust for the person who's seeking help, right? Or for the cause which needs help. And in many cases, in a way of saying, you're a marketing company. Isn't it? I'm assuming, because I come from advertising and I come from performance, digital marketing. And I think every campaign for you is a campaign, right? In which you are having to sort of convince someone through how you're doing that, right? So from that perspective, what helps tilt the trust equation?
I think, all things said and done, I mean, the usual stuff is there, which is essentially present as much information as you think you can, visuals and so on and so forth, the usual sort of suspects per se. But I think the core piece of it is trust is also not about, claiming what you will do, right, when things go right, but actually doing things that when things go wrong, what do you do, right? I think, trust is not earned in the 99% of the ops or 99% of the time. Trust is actually earned or lost in that 1% of the time when things don't go as whatever. Like for in our case, right, we have a lot of verification mechanisms, etc., etc. So say, okay, this is level 1, this is level 2. If it is medical, we do these. If it is something else, we do these. These are our SOPs. We follow it, etc., and so on. But SOPs are SOPs, right? It will get broken. People will figure ways to game it, etc., etc. Or there could be lapses itself in the following of SOPs and so on, right? What happens when how do you react? How do you communicate when that happens, right? I think that is the place where trust is either earned or trust is either lost, right? Not in the 99% of the time for us, right? So, be it a fraud, there is so for example, despite all the sort of the mechanisms we have, I think around 0.1 to 0.3% of our overall volumes are essentially affected by fraud, which means that if we were to sort of raise, like, for every 1,000 rupees, there is a chance that 1 to 3 rupees is essentially sort of going towards a fraudulent.
Not bad at all, right? I would have guessed a much higher number.
Yeah, which is not bad at all, and I hope that number remains that way. So primarily because crowdfunding is just entering mainstream, so we'll have to sort of be much more sort of diligent going forward. Until now,
you don't have the crypto bros there yet.
Yeah. We don't have the game, the folks who gamify the systems yet, so to speak. But how do you react when that happens, right? Do you acknowledge it, or do you wash off your hands off by saying, oh, we are just a platform? Because yes, your legalese will always sort of cover for your, because your liabilities per se, right? So as a platform,
right,
marketplace, even otherwise, right? Not just from, your own liabilities, but in general, from a communication perspective, you would always sort of keep it that as a separate and so on. But how do you react to the consumer per se is where the real thing about trust comes in. So, we screw up many times in a year. And the first thing that I always tell my team is go out there, tell the chronology of events, right? Tell what happened exactly when, how did this essentially transpire? And then the second thing I say is once you've established the chronology of events, establish what should have happened versus what happened. And third, essentially say, be open in acknowledging whether it is lapse at our end or it is a externality that we couldn't have possibly done. And fourth, always do what it takes to restore the customer's trust. So when we know that there has a fraud that has happened per se, and know for a fact that it has happened, and money has, despite the mechanisms, has gone out, we basically say we will refund the donors, right? It's essentially on Milaap's books. Now, it is not with the intent saying that because I do it, the customer is going to feel, oh, Milaap is a great trustworthy platform, etc. Obviously, their trust is broken, right? Because this is not something tangible for them, so to speak, right? Like, It's not like, okay, it's not like an e-commerce product. You gave a faulty product, I replaced it with a better product, and you feel, okay, great, right? Here, it is much more than that. There are emotions involved and so on, right? Which is why we say the least we can do is to refund their money, right? And that's also the stuff that we can essentially sort of have a control over. And how the customer reacts to it is their discretion, right? Some people would say, yes, this is what they were able to do. They returned their money. I would still contribute on platform. And that's great. That's good news, right? Most people might probably say, next time I contribute, I will not contribute to a stranger. I will only contribute to somebody that I really know of, which is fine, right? And a few people would say, no, I don't want to ever, use this platform in my life or whatever. And that's the default, because we have to sort of go with the saying that, yes, if something like this happens, you have to expect that 100% of the people may not return, right? And you are trying to sort of do something to bring some portion of the people convinced, right? Not the reverse, saying that by doing this, I'm expecting 100% of the people to return, and maybe some portion of the people may not. So those are some of the things that we've been sort of learning, instilling as a practice, so to speak. But yes, it's an interesting problem to sort of solve for.
Yeah, one thing I didn't hear much of you mention, and I thought that would be one of the realities of the market, is that Indians believe in karma, at least a certain proportion of this country sort of believes, because it's been instilled in you, in a manner of speaking, in a manner of bringing up, etc. Right? Is that true? I mean, do you see that element of that in your business?
Yes, because so one interesting thing that we do as part of our data analytics and the way we sort of segment the fundraisers and where contributions come, etc. Segment it in two ways. One is essentially what we call as altruists, which is essentially people do not know or know of the people that they are contributing. They just come to the platform, they just donate and they go, right? So they have no sort of connection any whatsoever. And then, the other ones, which is essentially what we call them the friends, which is essentially people who support their friends, people that they know. Almost 20% of the audience is essentially what we would classify as altruists, right? In the sense that, at least within the context of the platform, I'm sure the number might be bigger, truer sense. Which essentially, and when you,
only 1 in 5 is an altruist.
Yes, like 1 in 5 essentially contributes to a stranger that he has no sort of a first order, second order, third order sort of a connection. Of course, the remaining ones have a degree of separation, right? It could be a third order separation per se, right? But this is like like for example, somebody from US, California coming in and supporting somebody who is getting treated for heart disease in, let's say, a child in Bihar, right? Like there is no like connection, etc., etc. There's no like, it's not like shared by a mutual friend or a friend. They just come to the platform, they just whatever contribute, and 20% is sort of that number for us. And interesting piece essentially is if we were to, so we give people the option to sort of write comments, like show us, not just money, but also show your sign of support and so on and so forth. And words like or sentences which are essentially sort of around giving it forward, paying it forward, karma, for example, etc., and so on and so forth, keep sort of showing up in these sort of contributions. The second one is essentially relatability per se, like in the sense that people talk about their own experiences, like they themselves were a cancer survivor, so they saw somebody else and they want to essentially show, etc. So I think mostly it is sort of, giving itself is an extremely personal sort of a choice and a decision, right? So we do see that happening on the platforms as well. At least I can say like 20% of it is very explicit. I'm sure that the number might be much more than that.
If someone's watching this, right, you sort of answer this question in many ways, but if you have to summarize this, someone's watching this, has been thinking of, hey, listen, I know someone, there is a cause, I want something. If they want to put up a cause on Milaap, what are some of the 2-3 advices you will give them?
I think the first thing that I would say is, people ask me all the time, what story appeals, what kind of photos appeal, etc., and all of those per se, and very well-meaning questions per se. I always say one thing: just be authentic, right? No amount of, and they say, oh, you have a team which has a content team, marketing team, etc. Can they help us write the story? We can. I say, look, you be authentic. It's your story at the end of the day, right? There is no right or wrong. Of course, once your story is out there, everybody can essentially sort of come in and give you that feedback or whatever, right? Things to sort of, that's more of like whatever, right? That's like just brushing it here and there, kind of, so, bit of a formatting here and there. But the story has to be authentic. It doesn't matter whether you are an expert writer or not. Which is why we also provide what is called as a voice story per se, which is essentially you can just record because more than 60% of our fundraisers come from tier 2 plus these days. So, and people are not comfortable where English is their first sort of language per se. So what we provide is an option. We have a Milaap app where they can just record their story, so to speak. They can just speak it and we transcribe and we essentially sort of fit it. It has like a 70-80% accuracy, and then we sort of help them sort of structure it better. So being authentic is the number one thing. The second one essentially is, this is something that I tell people: between giving and asking is infinitely harder. Giving money is easy because it's easier. Let me not say easy, is easier because it's a decision that you can make in a split second. You do it and you're done, right? But asking for money, especially the people who use the platform, right, and for the needs that they use, right, they probably would do this once or twice in their lives, right? And nobody wakes up and saying, okay, every alternate year, they are going to sort of raise money for somebody's treatment, etc., or whatever, or they're facing a crisis, etc. So for them, the biggest challenge is essentially hesitancy, right? What would people think of me if I were to ask? How would people think of this, right? And my answer essentially to that is, look, if anything, crowdfunding makes it less harder and less awkward. right? Because you're telling your authentic story, you're putting it out there, you're putting it on your social networks, so to speak, and it makes it much more easier for people to offer their support rather than trying to sort of reach out to you one to one, so to speak. Like,
Yeah.
and the examples that I always tell is, look, you might have studied together. One of your friends is probably in US, etc., and whatever, and now you're sort of trying to raise money for a family emergency, etc. It is extremely awkward for that person, even after knowing that what you're going through, to actually ping you and say, "Hey, how can I support you?" Or very specifically, can I
Yeah.
support you in financial means, right? But when you have a crowdfunding page that is authentic and that is very clear about what your expectations are, it makes it infinitely easier for people to offer their support, per se, right? So the second most, first is be authentic. Second is, get out of the social stigma or the hesitancy, per se, right?
Hmm.
And the third one essentially is always to sort of, it doesn't end with the fundraising, per se. In fact, it only begins with the fundraising, so to speak. It is very important to sort of keep your donors updated as to what happened, right? How did you,
Hmm.
what was the outcome of it? And any news is good, right? Even bad news
That's
is good,
interesting.
right?
Yeah.
This is a challenge, that we've seen very early on, and we started inculcating, saying that, look, your storytelling and your sort of outreach cannot end the moment you raise money, right? In fact, it only begins. The more money you raise, it becomes even more important for you to sort of communicate, right? Often for
Right.
treatments, like, let's say, cancer treatment, etc., chemotherapy.
And you would recommend that
Yes.
people do this
Yes.
even when the progress is not at 100%.
Yes, absolutely. So we say every opportunity to sort of update is also an opportunity to ask.
Right.
And that ask can be monetary, that ask can be something else. In fact, we say, look, people are waiting to help. You just need to ask. But your ask should also sort of accompany with something that makes them feel that progress is being made, or that we are not at the same place where we were 30 days earlier, or whatever, etc. So it can be as simple as saying, and tremendous, right? Like, I remember one person who basically said, my daughter is going through this stem cell transplant, bone marrow transplant, 3-year-old girl, etc. And he had mentioned that I had prayed that if this goes through well, we would essentially sort of visit, I think, one of the temples. I can't remember, maybe, I think Shirdi temple or something like that. And he had put it. And you won't believe it, there were actually people who were replying 1 day, 2 day later with photos from the same temple, saying that we went and prayed for your daughter, etc. Right? And these are probably people who would have drove 4 or 5 hours or whatever, per se. Right? So the thing I'm trying to emphasize is, when you essentially sort of be authentic and vulnerable, which is anyway the place where you are at that point in time, when you communicate that, the kind of support that you would receive is much more than when you are sort of closed and not wanting to sort of share, and so on and so forth. So those are the three things we'd say: be authentic, communicate well, update, and most importantly, get out of the social stigma. Log kya kahenge is the biggest challenge of crowdfunding also.
We're well past the hour. And, we're towards the end of the episode. We're more than an hour. And I want to ask you something very personal, which is, I recently read somewhere that, Milaap has mobilized over 2,000 crores in donations, right? And that must be like a countless amount of medical situations you've supported, maybe lives you've saved, small companies that you've helped float, so on and so forth. In an era of unicorns and valuations and all of that, I'm assuming as you look back, this must be a huge motivation, right, to sort of keep doing what you're doing, right? I mean, I don't know if you even think on those lines, or if it's too caught up on how do I keep doing more. When you take a moment and look back, what are some of these things that you feel good about?
I think one is all things said and done, I've never woken up and basically said, why am I, should I go to office today, or should I work on this, etc., per se. I think the purpose of the work is essentially sort of the biggest driver, right, in terms of keeping you motivated. Of course, we all go through the highs and the lows and so on. So that, I'm not immune to it as well. But what has sort of kept going is one, the purpose. The second one is essentially people, right? So, it's also about working with people that you enjoy, right? So we are a team of right now around 120, 130 people, so to speak, right? And at least I know like at least 10 to 12 people of are were at one point in time sort of beneficiaries of Milaap in some way or other, like their extended relative essentially received assistance through a crowdfunding campaign and so on and so forth, or they themselves and so on and so forth. So for them, so to work with those kind of folks, you don't really need to sort of motivate why we should be doing this, right? Because they've sort of experienced the product, the experience, the solution. And in our case, that's like that's a very key sort of a thing. So these are the two sort of, the purpose and the people, so to speak, and having fun along the way. And when I say, yes, we don't take, yes, we did 2000 crores plus and so on and so forth, but we don't think of ourselves as we're changing the world, or we're making it a better place. And we don't sort of, yeah, I used to have those sort of lofty things when I was young, but I think over a period of time, I've realized that it's more to do with your own world, so to speak, right? Make a change in your own world, make your own sort of beliefs. You're doing this for yourself, right? So there is, what sort of, so to speak. So
Right.
that also sort of, allows us to sort of be grounded and, keep doing this, so to speak, right? We just bunch of people. Like if you see my team, right? Like we do everything in house. So there's tech, product, customer service, everything in-house, right? So these are all regular, whatever work, and it's no different from any other sort of a company, right? Like people banging their heads against some feature or some recon gone wrong, etc. So all the conversations are like that. Almost, it will be, if you listen, feels too transactional. You will be like, oh wow, these guys are. The outcome is this, but this is how they are essentially, working towards it and all those stuff. But that's the reality of sort of, making stuff moving on a daily basis. And that's what I, always sort of emphasize, right? It's just that our outcome of the work is essentially, somebody benefiting and being the medium of it. But everything else, let's not think of ourselves as, the whole holier thou, or, sort of thinking that we are, if that keeps you motivated on a day-to-day basis to show up, that's great, right? Because that's what keeps me motivated, in the sense that, yeah, I love what I'm doing, so I'm coming in purpose, right? But that cannot sort of define the reason, or if I were to put it, that that cannot be like, oh, this is what I'm doing, so I should essentially be sort of seen this way, etc. Not really, right? I'm just another small online business which is in the business of connecting people, and in the process people benefiting from it. So yeah, I don't know if I answered those questions, but yeah.
Right. You did. You were being extraordinarily modest, but you are changing the world into a slightly better place, and we all know how difficult that is to achieve. Right.
Yeah.
Anuj, we usually end the episode by asking our guest what he or she is watching, reading, or listening to. Right. Either related to what you do, or related to entrepreneurship, or just something that takes your mind off it. What's keeping you occupied?
I used to read a lot when I was growing up, and then after starting up and all that stuff, I stopped reading. I think for the past.
Yeah. I've heard this phrase: entrepreneurship often kills the quizzer.
Yeah. It has definitely killed the quizzer in me, right? So to a large extent. So I recently got into the hook of Audible and audiobooks per se, because that sort of allows for it. So the most recent one essentially is this book called The Obesity Code by Jason Fung. For the first, with COVID and all that stuff, and in general, whatever, I put on a lot of weight and so on and so forth, and tried multiple stuff. None of those seemed to work. And then this book sort of, I listened to it, and it made so much more sense in terms of how it was. And I said, okay, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot, right? He talks about how intermittent fasting, and how you should be looking at it from, more than what you eat. You should be looking at when you eat, and all of those. It's a fascinating story, and it actually started working for me. So I was like, boss, so this is good. So yeah, the Obesity Code is the one that I finished. Nice. And I'm now on the Cancer Code, which is also sort of in a similar journey as to While most people talk about cancer from a genetic perspective, it is more to do with environmental and sort of our lifestyle, etc. It's a different perspective. So that's one. The other one I'm a big fan of, especially COVID sort of reset my own aspirations of an entrepreneur. So I'm a big fan of this podcast called Rework by the Basecamp team, DHH and Jason Fried. And every time I listen to them, I have a chuckle. So I'm like, okay, I'm becoming a bigger fan by the day, so to speak. So those are some of the things, to listen. I can think of at the top of my mind. The other one,
awesome.
Is the Winner Takes It All.
Which is a podcast.
The Winner Takes It All is a book by Anand Giridhar Das, which again sort of talks about how the elites think that they're changing the world when in fact through philanthropy, when in fact they're making it worse off, right? So it's a very sort of a critical sort of a view, but a very interesting perspective per se, right? So
interesting.
So he basically says if they would pay their taxes, fair share of taxes, that's a much bigger sort of a way to sort of
philanthropy
get people.
Than anything.
Philanthropy, exactly. So he has a way with his words. So I love that perspective.
Wonderful. Sounds good. I did not know about that. So thank you. Anoj, thank you so much. A fascinating chat, and good luck with everything you're trying at Milaap.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karthik, for having me here. It was wonderful talking to you.
Cheers. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And Filter_Koffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
We know you love fast food,
Fast fashion,
faster payment.
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Dugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Wednesday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcasts. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.